Heroes of Reform. Having profiled some of Stirling's most notorious villains, we should perhaps pause to commemorate some of those in Scotland and elsewhere who saw the need to improve our prisons. Jeremy Bentham, 15th of February 1748 to 6th of June 1832. The Panopticon System. A philosopher and social reformer, Jeremy Bentham was a political pioneer, advocating many privileges which we now take for granted. He fought for the abolition of slavery, corporal punishment, and the death penalty, and advocated equal rights for women, the right to divorce, and the decriminalisation of homosexuality. He even argued for animal rights. Bentham was a utilitarian, believing that the worth of an idea, action, rule, or law should be judged on the basis of its positive outcome. Traditional forms of punishment and imprisonment, he reasoned, were unfit for purpose because they failed to reform or rehabilitate offenders and often made things worse. Prisoners treated unfairly became less inclined to fairness. A fair world, he thought, was one where each gesture, every turn or limb or feature in those whose motions have a visible impact on the general happiness will be noticed and marked down. Transparency, he argued, was vital. There could be no crime if we were unable to conceal it. Bentham's prison design, the Panopticon, was devised with this belief in mind. It allowed a watchman to observe every inmate of an institution from a single central vantage point, without them being able to tell whether or not they were being watched. This, he hoped, would encourage them to lead good lives. Bentham, a philosopher and therefore impractical, imagined not just prisons but whole cities being built to this model. Many judged the philosopher's ideas to be intrusive and naive, and no Panopticon prisons were built during his lifetime, though elements of the design were incorporated in many 19th and 20th century prison designs, including Thomas Brown's for Stirling's new county jail, the Old Town Jail in which you're now standing. John Howard, 2nd of September 1726 to 20th of January 1790, the father of prison reform. Appointed High Sheriff of Bedfordshire in 1773, Enfield-born John Howard's duties required him to inspect his county jail. He was shocked by what he found and was inspired to set about a systematic tour of prisons throughout England. He was outraged by the squalor and cruelty he saw, particularly that meted out to the poorest prisoners, whose sentences were extended because they could not pay the jailer's fee or jailer's fiel, an amount paid to the owner or keeper of a prison for their upkeep. Taking this issue to Parliament, he was commended by the House for the humanity and zeal of his investigations. Visiting several hundred prisons across the British Isles and parts of Europe, Howard published The State of Prisons in 1777. It detailed his observations and set out his own practical suggestions for improvements which would promote the most efficient means of penal treatment and crime prevention. Howard's model prison could not hope to reform the prisoner if it wholly denied him of his humanity and his dignity. Howard calculated that he had travelled over 42,000 miles, visiting prisons throughout his lifetime. His final journey took him to the jails of the Crimea, where he contracted typhus and died. The humanity and zeal which so impressed the House of Commons had inspired others worldwide. His influence on Elizabeth Fry, Frederick Hill, William Brebner, and other key prison reformers of the 19th century is immeasurable. Today there are Howard Leagues for penal reform in Britain and New Zealand, a John Coward Society in Canada, and Virginia's Howard Association and Illinois' John Howard Association continue his work in the United States of America. A statue of Howard was erected in St. Paul's Cathedral, London, on the 1890 centenary of his death, the first civilian to be honoured there. Elizabeth Fry, 21st of May 1870 to 12th of October 1845. The Angel of Prisons. A Quaker, born in Norfolk, Fry was a major driving force behind new legislation to make the treatment of prisoners more humane, finding support from the highest and lowest in the land. Queen Victoria and Robert Peel, Prime Minister and founder of the modern police force, were both admirers. Since 2001, she has been depicted on the Bank of England's £5 note. Fry was horrified by the conditions in London's notorious Newgate prison, which she first visited around 1812. The tiny area set aside for female felons was overcrowded with women and children, unsupervised and squalid. In the years which followed, she worked passionately to improve conditions, arranging for food, clean clothing, bedding, and education for adults and children alike. In 1817, she helped found the Association for the Reformation of the Female Prisoners in Newgate, and later the British Ladies' Society for promoting the reformation of female prisoners, the first nationwide women's organisation in Britain. Fry's approach was direct and effective. She stayed the night in many prisons, sleeping alongside the convicts, and encouraged others to do likewise and witness firsthand the dehumanising conditions they endured, which prevented, as far as she was concerned, their rehabilitation. Winning the friendship and trust of the prisoners, she felt, was the first step in encouraging them to improve themselves and their prospects. In 1818, Mrs. Fry's brother, Thomas Fowell Buxton, who shared her reforming zeal, was elected to Parliament as MP for Weymouth and began promoting her ideals in the House. In that year, Fry gave evidence to a House of Commons Committee on Prison Conditions, becoming the first woman ever to present evidence to Parliament. Frederick Hill, 29th of June, 1803 to 1896. Scotland's first Inspector of Prisons. Born at Hilltop, Birmingham, Hill had no knowledge of the prison system when he applied for the post of Inspector of Prisons for Scotland in 1835. Taking advice from the formidable Elizabeth Fry, who had visited many prisons in Scotland and the north of England 2 decades earlier, Hill was convinced by her argument that the reform was the only answer to the problem of crime. He was also greatly saddened to discover that conditions had not changed since Fry's northern tour, writing that prisoners were herded together, young and old, good or bad, without any distinction as to their various offences, and were left to corrupt one another. No work was provided, and they passed their time in idleness, drunkenness, and gambling. Hill believed that education, vocational training, and solitary reflection were essential to the reform of the individual, to release them from the pernicious trap of poverty and criminality. And the Board of Directors of Prisons for Scotland he established in 1839 set about a massive programme of reconstruction and reorganisation throughout Scotland. His 12 years here were productive and satisfying. Repeat offending dropped sharply, evidence that attempts to reform the prison population, rather than simply confine and punish it, were effective. In 1847, he became Inspector of Prisons for the north of England and much of Wales. If he was frustrated by the resistance to reform he had experienced in Stirling, whose new county jail would open that same year, he was confounded by the obstacles put in his way in these new territories. His health suffered, and the following year he eagerly accepted an offer from his brother, Rowland Hill, founder of the Penny Post, to assume the less stressful position of Assistant Secretary at the Post Office. William Brebner, 1783 to the 2nd of January, 1845. The Good Master. Born in Huntly, Aberdeenshire, William Brebner began a lifetime's work in Scotland's prisons as a humble clerk at the South Prison in Glasgow, rising to be governor of that city's Bridewell and superintendent of prisons for Lanarkshire, in which roles he was highly regarded for devising and carrying into execution schemes for the moral rescue and amelioration of the thousands of beings committed to his charge, regarded not as a jailer and taskmaster, but as a father and friend. Affectionately known as the Good Master, Brebner introduced his separate system to the Bridewell in 1825. Solitary confinement had often been used as a punishment in prisons, but Brebner's approach to isolation was radically different. Allowed no exposure to the bad influences of other inmates, convicts were to experience regular, constructive contact with teachers, chaplains, medical staff, and well-trained warders. Every prisoner was expected to complete a full day's constructive work for which they would receive fair payment. Ahead of his time, he introduced an early form of day release for many of his convicts, who went out to work each day to tend to their work and provide for their families, but came back to the Bridewell in the evening. Recognising the stresses many former convicts experienced on re-entering society, he established several houses of refuge, halfway houses as we'd call them today. To the great annoyance of his critics and the delight of fellow reformers, Brebner's innovations worked. A powerful voice in Frederick Hill's newly established General Board of Prisons, the good master was a passionate advocate of reform literally until his last breath. He died of a heart attack on his way to a meeting of the board on the 2nd of January, 1845.